Good afternoon. I'm David Ferriero, the Archivist of the United States, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to the William G. McGowan Theater for today's noontime lecture. And a special welcome to those of you who are joining us through our YouTube channel. Before we bring Admiral Stavridis to tell us about his memoir, I'd like to tell you about two other programs coming up soon here in the McGowan Theater. On Thursday, November 20th at noon, Kevin Gover, Director of the National Museum of the American Indian, and Suzanne Harjo, Guest Curator of Nation to Nation, a new exhibit at the museum, will be here to talk about the exhibit and its companion book. The exhibit includes treaties from the National Archives, and the book explores the promises, diplomacy, and betrayals involved in treaties and treaty making between the United States government and Native nations. 2 weeks later, on Thursday, December 4th, at noon, Stanley Weintraub will tell the story of tens of thousands of American troops who were trapped by the Chinese along the Yalu River border at the end of 1950. He recounts their Christmas escape in his book, A Christmas Far From Home, an epic tale of courage and survival during the Korean War. To learn more about these and all of our public programs and exhibits, consult our monthly calendar of events, and there are copies in the lobby as well as sign-up sheets where you can receive it by regular mail or email. And another way to get more involved in the National Archives is to become a member of the Foundation for the National Archives. The Foundation supports all of our work in education and outreach, and there are applications for membership also in the lobby. Today we welcome Admiral James Stavridis to the National Archives. In the summer of 2009, Jim became the first naval officer to hold NATO's top military position, that of Supreme Allied Commander Europe. He has called his memoir of his years at NATO the Accidental Admiral. But former Senator Joe Lieberman says there was nothing accidental about Jim Stavridis becoming an admiral or Supreme Allied Commander in Europe. Lieberman continues, whether dealing with Afghanistan, Russia, or the Middle East, Jim has always demonstrated an ability to find new ways to look at and try to resolve age-old problems. The man who appointed him to the top NATO job, Secretary of Defense Robert Gates, praises the book and the man. Admiral Jim Stavridis is one of the most forward-thinking military officers and enlightened leaders of his generation. The Accidental Admiral gives readers a window into what it is like to wrestle through with the toughest 21st century problems of strategy and diplomacy. The Admiral attended the U.S. Naval Academy at Annapolis and spent 37 years in the Navy, rising to the rank of four-star admiral. Among his many commands were 4 years as Supreme Allied Commander at NATO, where he oversaw operations in Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, and the Balkans, and piracy off the coast of Africa. He also commanded U.S. Southern Command in Miami, Florida, which is charged with military operations through Latin America. In the course of his Navy career, he served as senior military assistant to the Secretary of the Navy and the Secretary of Defense. He led the Navy's premier operational think tank for innovation, Deep Blue, immediately after the 9/11 attacks. He won the Battenberg Cup for commanding the top ship in the Atlantic Fleet and the Navy League John Paul Jones Award for Inspirational Leadership, along with over 40 U.S. and international medals and decorations. He earned a PhD from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University and has won academic honors from the National and Naval War Colleges. He's published 5 books on leadership, Latin America, ship handling, and innovation, as well as over 100 articles in leading journals. An active user of social networks, he has thousands of followers on Twitter and friends on Facebook. And his TED Talk on 21st Century Security in 2012 has had over 600,000 views. He's also in his spare time, he is chair of the board of the U.S. Naval Institute and has won both the Proceedings and USNI Press Author of the Year awards. Since the summer of 2013, he has been dean at the Fletcher School. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Admiral James Stavridis.
Thank you. Well, my thanks to all of you for coming out on a bitterly cold Washington day and finding your way to the National Archives. David, thank you for a way over-the-top introduction. In fact, when people hear that introduction, they often say, Stavridis, if you're so terrific, why were you not a naval aviator? Why didn't you fly fast jets? I drove ships around rather slowly through the oceans. And the answer is because as a young boy, I had a very traumatic experience that made aviation very difficult for me. I had hair then, too. So the form is to kind of talk about the book. And if you'll permit me, I'm happy to talk about the book, perhaps in some questions or comments at the end of my brief talk today. But what I'd really like to talk about is reading. Why reading matters. Why books matter so deeply. And they have mattered to me, and I suspect most of you, because you are folks who would come to a book talk, love books as well. So I thought what I might do in about 20 minutes is talk a little bit about why reading matters, what are some of the challenges we see in the world today, and how books and reading, both fiction and nonfiction, can inform us, delight us, and help us be better leaders. Hence the title of this brief talk, Reading and Leading. Well, let me start with a very brave young woman. I think most folks these days know the Nobel Prize winner, Malala of Pakistan. You see her here reading a book, which is the act that caused the Taliban to shoot her in Pakistan when she was only 13 years old. Miraculously, she survived that and continues to thrive. And I'm always struck when I see her interviewed, and I would aspire to meet her one day, when I see her interviewed talking about the importance of reading and education and how it matters. In her case, of course, she focuses on young women and their education. But I think it's metaphor for how important reading is for all of us. And let me give you an example from my time as the NATO commander of how important books are. These are Afghan police officers in the police training regime in Kabul, just outside of Kabul. And you see them reading books. And you ought to say, well, that's strange. I thought I read somewhere that Afghans in this age demographic, in their 20s and early 30s, are largely illiterate. And you would be correct. They are largely illiterate because the Taliban withheld education from them for the period of time in which the Taliban were in power. Okay, so why are they reading books? And the answer is they're in literacy training. This is a literacy class in Afghanistan where we are teaching them to read. We, the United States, we, NATO, we, public-private partnerships of very brave people who go to Afghanistan to teach reading to young Afghans in the police and the military. In Afghanistan, if you can read, you put a pen in your pocket so it's visible, so others can see it and identify you as someone who can read. When these young men and women graduate from this literacy course, we give them a pen to put in their pocket. And when you see the look on their face at that moment, you understand that in the end, security is not about building walls. It's about building bridges. And in this case, reading is the bridge to knowledge, the bridge to a better life, enabling them to be more active and coherent participants in creating security in their country. Now, you see guns in that picture as well. We teach them to fight also, and they're fighting hard in Afghanistan. But I would argue one of the most lasting things we will do in Afghanistan is give the gift of literacy to this generation, this lost generation who would have learned to read under the Taliban. The good news is, today in Afghanistan, there are 9 million children in school. 5 million of them boys, 4 million young girls. That's, in the end, what will really change Afghanistan and help it move forward. I think reading will be a big part of that. Unfortunately, there are nations where reading is not as widely permitted or reading is restricted. One I'd point to is North Korea, which is almost a dystopian society in certain ways, in which information and the books people read are withheld. We should worry also about the cost of immense civil war in a place like Syria, where children, unfortunately, these days probably don't have a lot of time to pick up books and read. And we ought to think also about places like Iran, where the view is adjusted and skewed. So we ought to understand the privilege that we have of reading and not being in a place like today's southeastern Ukraine, where a civil war rages. So these kind of problems and challenges, I think, are significant. They are part of the fabric of this unfolding world. And we learn about how to deal with it. We learn how to be a good leader in so many ways, I think, from books. Here's one I am recommending at the moment to try and understand what Robert Kaplan very aptly has called Asia's cauldron, this kind of bubbling sense of tension in East Asia. He talks in the book about relations between Japan and China, but also the rest of the nations in that part of the world, which really is kind of on a low boil. In today's world, the headlines are dominated by what's going on in Ukraine and what's going on in Syria and Iraq and Ebola. But running on the back channel is the challenge of Asia. Books can help unlock that as well. Ebola is another challenge that is out in front of us, and I'll talk in a few moments about a book that would help us think through and understand some aspects of dealing with pandemics. So what I'd like to do today, with having set up this idea that reading matters and that the topics of our day are very challenging, let me talk a little bit about some books that have worked for me and I think for others, and talk about some things that I've learned from each of those books. And hopefully that will be a backdrop, if you will, to The Accidental Admiral. So David mentioned, before I was the NATO commander, I had a rather unexpected set of orders to go be the commander of U.S. Southern Command, which is placed me in charge of military operations south of the United States. Headquarters Miami, which was terrific, my hometown. But in addition to reading about the geography, the history, brushing up on my Spanish, preparing for it in kind of conventional ways, I also reached out for the literature of Latin America and the Caribbean. And I could talk for a long time about a variety of different authors that I came to admire deeply during that period. But here's four. I think most folks who have read even a little bit of Latin American literature and understand magical realism would have read 100 Years of Solitude by the Nobel laureate Gabriel Garcia Marquez. Second, recent Nobel laureate Mario Vargas Llosa wrote The Feast of the Goat, which is a novel about the Trujillo dictatorship in the Dominican Republic, illuminating the very worst of the Latin American dictators. And that's a high bar to get over. Trujillo and his regime are part of the fabric of dictatorship that ran through much of the Americas in the post-World War II era. Inés of My Soul by Isabel Allende is a very different novel. It's set in Chile during the Spanish colonial period, and it's the story of a marvelous woman who becomes part of the formation of modern-day Chile. And again, all told through a woman's viewpoint. very, very well crafted. And then to find probably the quirkiest Latin American writer of his generation, Roberto Bolaño, who died some years ago, an untimely death after a drug addiction. The Savage Detectives is a big, quirky novel set in Mexico that tries to help us understand that very complex society. So the message for me as I approached Latin America and the Caribbean was not only the conventional ways of preparing, but to also read the literature of the region to understand it. And I would argue until you've dived into these books, this kind of understanding of the region, you will not truly be able to understand it. So I finished up at U.S. Southern Command. I had 3 wonderful years down there, enjoyed every minute of it, and I was ready then to get out of the Navy. And I had actually worked very hard for an opportunity to go work at the University of Miami for Donna Shalala, who is the current president there. I was going to work at the School of Oceanography, which would be any Navy guy's dream, when very unexpectedly, at least to me, Secretary Gates called me up and said, "Jim, I want you to do one more tour in uniform," and offered me the position of Supreme Allied Commander of NATO. And so I asked President Shalala what she thought. She said, "Supreme Allied Commander of NATO, working at the School of Oceanography. Jim, I think you ought to go to Europe." So I did. And again, I felt as though I wanted to read in order to prepare myself for the job. And these are some of the books I read as I was preparing to go to Europe, to kind of understand the backstories in Europe. One Soldier's War by Arkady Babenko is a book about the Russian counterinsurgency experience in Chechnya. And it is a searing look at a world on fire that helped me understand the Russian military, helped me better understand counterinsurgency as I prepared to think about it in the context of Afghanistan. In the center atop there is a nonfiction book by James Sheehan, Where Have All the Soldiers Gone? It's about the European militaries. And often the Europeans are criticized these days for not spending enough on defense, for not fighting hard enough alongside us in various locales, the caveats that sometimes are placed on their forces in Afghanistan. This is a book that helps understand the historical backstory of the 20th century that contributes to the European sensibility about the employment of force. And it is a profoundly important book for someone who is going to go and negotiate and talk with other European military leaders. I loved reading Partners in Command about General Eisenhower, who was the first Supreme Allied Commander of NATO, what was then NATO SHAPE, and of course General Marshall, and their relationship and how they were able to create positive outcomes in the immense tasks that they faced both in World War II and afterward, and really throughout their careers. To understand Russian sensibilities, you can kind of drop the CIA report. You don't have to read the CIA intel necessarily. Pick up One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich to understand the Russian way of dealing with adversity. If you want to understand how the sanctions that are being imposed today on Russia as a result of the invasion and annexation of Crimea, how's that playing in the Russian psychology? Read One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich. Russians are very tough-minded people who can cope with adversity. So it's worth understanding that as you think about the sanction effect. Absurdistan is a kind of a light novel in certain ways by Gary Steingart. It's about a thinly veiled version of Azerbaijan in the post-Soviet space. And if you want to understand piracy off the coast of Africa, I'd recommend Elmore Leonard, incredibly popular writer, just passed away, probably the best writer of pure dialogue since Hemingway. And Elmore Leonard's book, Djibouti, helped me understand the piracy issues and the West African world better. And then lastly, on books that I read as I got ready or was in my job as the NATO commander dealing with war and counterinsurgency, Karl Marlantes' extraordinary book about Vietnam, about the failures of the United States there, the courage of the individuals who were there. The archivist of the United States, David Farrow, was there as a young Navy corpsman. My father was there as a Marine colonel. This is a book that helped me understand counterinsurgency and gave me lessons that we could apply by not doing much of what occurred in Vietnam, frankly. The Afghan Campaign is by Stephen Pressfield. Many of you will have read Gates of Fire, I suspect, which is probably his best-known book. But the Afghan Campaign is about the first campaign in Afghanistan, not the NATO campaign, not the Soviet campaign, not the several British campaigns, but Alexander the Great's campaign. And you can drop a plumb line from today's Pashtun world back to the one Alexander encountered as well. These are two memoirs. There's any number of good memoirs and indeed some great fiction that's emerging today from the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And these are two that help me understand the junior officer viewpoint involved in this, because by the time I was engaged in Afghanistan, in Iraq, it had been many years, to say the least, since I had been in my 20s and in the kind of situation that these young officers faced. So books help us prepare, and they help us learn to be better leaders. And what I'll try and do now is mention just half a dozen books and what I took away from each of them that helped me, and hopefully today helps me, continue to be a positive leader. I think many, certainly of maritime background, have read the novels of Patrick O'Brian, 20 volumes. It might be the longest sustained work of historical fiction ever written, and it is fabulous. It's Jane Austen Goes to Sea. And it is all set in and around the Napoleonic Wars and focuses on a ship captain and his surgeon intelligence officer. There's a film, A Master and Commander, which picks up the title. But the books are extraordinary, and they really are one long meditation on this, on teamwork, on how you bring a crew together, how you create oars that move together. And we don't have time this afternoon to go through each of the individual things you can pull out of these books, but as a sustained discussion of how to lead, these books by Patrick O'Brian helped me a great deal. More recently, as I'm kind of grappling with cyber and the world of social networks, I came across David Eggers' book, The Circle. Eggers is one of the most interesting, iconoclastic writers currently putting pen to paper. He writes fiction, nonfiction. He writes things that are kind of in the middle and hard to categorize. This book, The Circle, is a world in which all of kind of the social network, social media companies are, if you will, merged into one. So think about a world where there is Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram, Pinterest. They're all kind of merged into one huge company called The Circle. And obviously that would be a company with a great deal of power and a great deal of knowledge about each and every one of us in the society. So that's the backdrop. And walking into the scenario I've described is a young woman coming for her very first job at this company, The Circle. What I took away from it is the power of social networks. This is the world according to Facebook. The brighter the white, the higher the concentration of Facebook users. Today, Facebook is just about surpassing China and India in total number of people. Facebook, pushing, I think, 1.2 billion people. So this is a world in which we have to be leaders. We have to move our messages. And here I don't mean, I'm at the omelet shop this morning. I'm talking about using social networks to move the messages that matter. And those are things like democracy, liberty, freedom of speech, freedom of information, freedom of education, freedom of assembly, gender rights, human rights, racial equality. These are good ideas. We need to move them on these social networks because there are people like the Islamic State who don't agree with those values. They're using these social networks extremely effectively. We need to do more of that. I think the lesson I took from the circle is that leaders must know and understand this world as well as the very conventional ways of communicating. So here's a novel that I'm going to guess everybody in the room has read. I hope so. If you haven't, you're in for a treat. A very short novella. There are a lot of things that come out of this. But first and foremost, I recommend it to you as a book that you reread. It's a very different book to read it in your mid-50s than to read it in your teens or your early 20s. And that's a whole separate discussion, rereading books, bringing what you have gained in your life to a book that you treasured as a young person. What did I take away from Hemingway, from this book? Determination. Determination. Just like Santiago is going to get that fish home, that dog is going to get that ball. And that's a pretty good lesson. And again, in your mid-50s, to reread The Old Man and the Sea is to come face to face with why determination matters. It's a very good lesson that bears repeating. So if you'll permit me a Navy memoir, one that's vastly better than The Accidental Admiral. This is The On Purpose Admiral. This is Elmo Zumwalt, who became the Chief of Naval Operations at an extremely young age and was probably the most innovative officer ever to sit in that position. And he was someone who thrived on new ideas, new challenges, but then trying to solve them in innovative and creative ways. And innovation, and these are merely some examples of innovations, some big, some small, but innovation, I think, is the lifeblood of leadership. What you have to do as a leader is put new ideas, new challenges, and creative ways of solving problems in front of young people. Doing that, I would argue, is the most rewarding part of leadership, and you certainly got that from Elmo Zumwalt and his life and times. Another famous military figure in our society, somebody I deeply admire, someone I'm very honored to say has taken some time to mentor me along the way. I asked him his advice on going to be the NATO commander in Europe. And he said, well, Jim, you'll be okay. Just remember that you are never going to be Charlemagne over there. General Powell's book, My American Journey, I think is wonderfully, wonderfully constructed. It's full of lessons of life and leadership. What I took away from it is the same quality that you see in this extraordinary athlete, Roger Federer, which is grace under pressure. It is the ability that Federer has, that Colin Powell has, to be cool and calm. You'll never see Roger Federer throwing rackets, screaming and yelling, blowing up on a tennis court. He's cooler and cooler as the pressure gets higher and higher. And that's a quality that I can see in General Powell, and it's a good quality to try and emulate. And I think that's another aspect of reading and leading, is reading books by leaders and seeing what you can take away and put into practice in your own life and your own approach. So a little bit on the darker side. This is The Orphan Master's Son, which came out 2 years ago, National Book Award winner. And it is a look inside of North Korean society, a look inside a very dystopian place. And it follows the life and the struggles of a young North Korean Special Forces officer. And it has a kind of a Charles Dickens-like quality to it. I mean, if Dickens had gone to Pyongyang and written a novel, this would be it. What I took away from it is a sense that sometimes in a society, it's hard to see that what you're doing is wrong because everybody's doing it, because it just looks normal. And I think if you were in North Korean society, you would have that sense. And let me give you an example of something along those lines from our society. So this is a beautiful Navy warship, photograph taken in the late 40s. You see the crew of the warship out here in front. Everybody looking good. You got the officers here. You got the chief petty officers here. You got the crew standing in formation. So I have this photograph. A friend gave it to me. And I started looking closely at it. And I thought, look at this second row. These are the chief petty officers. And what's wrong here? There's a hole here. You know, why would you put a formation together and have 3 people, then have, looks like about 3 spots, and then have the rest of your chief's mess here? And you got your wardroom, all your officers here in front. What happened here? So I started looking very closely at this photograph, and you can find the 3 missing chief petty officers. They're African Americans. 1, 2, 3. Now, I don't know what happened on this day when the photograph was taken, but I'll give you a guess. My guess is that the executive officer, probably this fella, second in command, his job is to put the formation together, and then the captain, this fella, you can tell by the scrambled eggs here, then that captain would come down, sit down, snap the photo, doesn't waste the captain's time. This is a guess on my part. My guess is the formation was set with the 3 African-American chief petty officers here. The captain came down and said, go back there. Go to the back. What do we do in a society? What are we doing today that when we look back on it looks very strange to us, looks wrong? This is an example of that. And if you read The Orphan Master's Son and think about dystopian societies, the worst part of a dystopian society is that you don't know it's dystopian. Here's another dystopian society, Margaret Atwood's deeply chilling The Handmaid's Tale. This is a very dark novel, set in a kind of an ill-defined potential future. And it's really about the role of women and the subjugation of women. Again, a very, very hard novel to read. Margaret Atwood is an extraordinary Australian writer. What I take away from that is how important it is that we create a society in which women are not living the Handmaid's Tale, that they are involved, for example, at the Fletcher School in our Women in International Security program. You cannot achieve 100% of a society's potential with 50% of its population. It seems quite obvious. We've improved at that in parts of the world, but there are other parts of the world that still have aspects of this. I would argue that's a lesson from The Handmaid's Tale that reinforce for me the importance of the role of women. So biography is a wonderful genre, and most of us in this room, I would suspect, have read a fair number of biographies. I cannot get enough biography of Roosevelt. I deeply enjoyed the third volume of Edmund Morris's trilogy about Colonel Roosevelt. Most of you probably know this third volume is set at the end of his life. He's been the president. He goes to Europe. Everybody says, in respect, Mr. President this, Mr. President that. Roosevelt says, no, there can only be one president at a time. Please call me Colonel Roosevelt. And that's kind of the theme of the work, this last decade of his very complicated life. What I took away from that book is, from my own enjoyment and fascination with Theodore Roosevelt's life, it made me think about who are the other people I really admire. This is a good exercise to do. If you have never really stopped and said, who are the people I really admire in my life? Let's go home and write that list out, 5, 7, 10 people, and they can be family members. That's my father in Vietnam in 1967 as a Marine colonel. They can be political figures, Madeleine Albright, Condoleezza Rice. They can be historical figures, Simón Bolívar. They can be figures from academic world. This is Clay Christensen, who's one of the most profound writers about innovation today, a professor at Harvard Business School. So write down the people you admire and say to yourself, why do I admire them? What are those qualities they have? And how am I doing? That's a pretty good exercise, whether you're 25, 45, 59, wherever you are in the spectrum, it's a good check on what you believe in. So let me turn back to Europe for a little known but very powerful novel about the Balkans. This was a book I read in preparation for learning and being involved in the NATO mission in Kosovo. The Bridge on the Drina. Ivo Andrić won the Nobel Prize largely for this book, which is about cultures coming together. The Balkans, in the end, is one of the most challenging melting pots of ethnicity and religion in the world. And what I learned from that book is simply this: the value of bridges. I talked early in my few moments here about walls failing us so often in security. In the end, it is bridges that will permit us the best chance of creating security in our society. I learned that partly from reading The Bridge over the Drina. A last novel to mention, this is brand new, just out now, nominated for this year's National Book Award. I think it's in the final 5. Station 11 is a very quirky novel about a pandemic. And I picked it up kind of in response to the Ebola discussions we're having. This is the far end, the dark end of the pandemic spectrum, and is really worth considering as you wrestle with what that might look like. Because after a pandemic, this is what we might find. We might find ourselves reaching endlessly for that cell phone signal that meant so much to us earlier, and finding ourselves on a beach without access. And that would be the darkest thing I could imagine, is not being able to connect with the world of books, a world in which reading really matters. So last image, this is Wikipedia, which is the biggest online body of knowledge ever assembled and building every single day. And as you all know, Wikipedia is not assembled by 12 really smart people locked in a closet writing all those articles. Wikipedia is created by all of us. Every day, tens of thousands of people input into the wiki and contribute to it. And every day, millions of people draw that knowledge, that information out. Wikipedia, I think, is a perfect example of the fact that no one of us is as smart as all of us thinking together. That's the power of books. That's what connects us. That's what builds bridges. The vision statement of Wikipedia is a world in which every human being can freely share in the sum of all knowledge. A world in which every human being can freely share in the sum of all knowledge. My thesis for us is that by reading, learning, leading, collaborating, building bridges, together we create the sum of all security for our society. Thank you very much. There's the Accidental Admiral. Thanks. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks a lot. I'd be glad to, again, talk about my very small book or any of these really terrific books we have talked about. Since this is being fed to internet and YouTube and a couple other places, if you have a question, it would be great if you could step to one of the microphones and ask it. If that's inconvenient, I'll try and repeat it. But we need to do that so it becomes part of the record of our event today. Anybody?
Yes, sir, Admiral. How did you come to select those books that you went through and decided were the significant ones to help you prepare for those
That's
assignments?
a great question. Thank you. I walked through my house. I got about 4,000 books in the house. As my wife says, a gentle madness. And I would stop at a bookshelf and say, that's a terrific book. And thus I ended up with a stack of 30 or 40 books, break. On the other side, I tried to write out what were some of the points I wanted to make about innovation, about teamwork, about having a hero. And then I tried to cross those two things together and say, okay, that's a book that illustrates that point, etc. But it's a fun exercise, and it's great for people who love books to spend time walking through your library, the New York Public Library, or any library, and think about what you've learned from a particular book. So thanks for asking that. Yes, sir.
Why the title of your book?
Sure. Two reasons. The first is that traditionally, for the entire period of time that the NATO command has existed, the Supreme Allied Commander had always been a general, So I was very much in the mind of there'll never be an admiral who becomes the NATO commander. I just would never even have conceived it, nor I think would any of my friends who were generals. And when Secretary Gates called me, I literally, what flashed in my mind when he said, Jim, we want you to be the NATO commander, I thought, there's been some terrible accident. And he really is calling me to tell me I'm going to go to the Pacific Command, which is where admirals always go. There's always been an admiral as the Pacific commander. And as we went through the conversation, I came to understand that, no, I was really going to do this job. So in that sense, it felt quite accidental to be the first admiral out of 16 Supreme Allied Commanders. But then the second point of the title is that I think for all of us, our lives are a kind of a series of accidents. And I certainly never came out of Annapolis saying, yeah, I want to be an admiral. In fact, I came out of Annapolis saying, yeah, I want to get through my 5-year obligation and go to law school. And I just about did. I put in a letter of resignation in my late 20s. And an accident, a detailer, we call them in the Navy, who is your human resources professional, called me when he received my letter of resignation and said, you know, Stavridis, your record isn't really that bad. How about if we sent you to law school? And I said, oh, well, okay, that might be interesting, you know, because I'd indicated in the letter my intent to get out and go to law school. And I said, well, where would I go to law school? And he said, well, I don't know. Let me work on that. And he called me back a couple of days later, and he said, hey, I got good news. I got money for you to go to law school. I said, great. How does that work? Are you going to send me the money, or do I expense the Navy? You know, how's this work? And I heard papers shuffling on his desk. And he said, I got money for you to go to the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. And I said, well, you know, sir, that's not a law school. That's a school of international relations. And he said, long pause. And he said, look, it's got law in the title. I got money to pay for it. Do you want to go? So I went, accident. And so, I mean, I guess we could say I'm probably the accidental dean of the Fletcher School as well. But I guess the secondary meaning of the title is simply that I think for all of us, our lives are a series, hopefully of happy and occasionally of sad accidents. And there's really no way to predict. And while I've enjoyed my time in the Navy, I certainly don't ascribe it to a great you. Let's put it that way. Sir.
Stavridis.
Hi. Oh, great to see you. How are you?
Just wanted to ask, as a prolific author, when do you do your writing? I know how do you construct a book and go about,
Sure.
and what time of day works for you?
Yeah, that's a great question. I've been a writer kind of my whole life, and really a reader. And let me start with the reading. Why do I read so much? Why do I enjoy it so much? It's for a kind of prosaic reason. When I was 8 years old, my dad got a set of orders. He was in the Marine Corps, and my dad got a set of orders to Athens, Greece, to be part of the Marine company at the embassy in Athens. So that was 1963, when there was essentially no television in Greece. There was no way you could watch television. So from like 8, 9, 10, 11 years old, with no TV to watch, I'd literally go to the library, get stacks of books, come home, and when I think my contemporaries in the United States were blissfully watching Roy Rogers on TV, I was reading books. And it wasn't because I was scholarly, it's because that was the only form of entertainment I could get at. So that made me a reader very early, and I think readers become writers. And then I had the kind of normal progression of people who like to write. I was on the junior high school, mimeographed newsletter, and then the editor of my high school newspaper, the editor of the Log magazine, which is the literary, and that's a stretch, the literary magazine of the Naval Academy. Not much literature in that. But I always loved writing. And so, to your question, with that as backdrop, I have always found it easy for me to write in very small bursts. In other words, some people, Hemingway famously, set aside 4 hours every morning and went and worked. And if you go to his house in Key West, which I highly recommend you do, you can go and look at the kind of writer's garret that is built as an offshoot of the main house. I just don't need that. I can, in fact, in the car on the way over here, I had my laptop open working on an article for Foreign Policy. I can write for 5-7 minutes, drop it, and come back. I can do the same thing with a book. I don't need to set aside. It's probably because my mind is choppy, and I find that as a result of that, I can write in very small periods of time and then kind of put it all together. In terms of the Accidental Admiral, that came out of a journal. I kept a journal through those 4 years as the NATO commander. I've only kept a journal twice in my life. Once for the 3 years that I had my first ship command, called The Barry. That book became Destroyer Captain, about being a very insecure and frequently error-prone commanding officer. And then this period of time, these 4 years. So I ended up 4 years as the NATO commander with a big stack of a journal. and then I just went back and edited it down, edited it down, edited it down, which is not unlike how Carl Merlantes and his editor worked on Matterhorn, about Carl's experiences as a junior officer in Vietnam. Came out of an 850-page manuscript that he scrubbed down to that very brilliant novel. And I don't mean to compare his novel, which is fantastic, with my memoir, which is honest. But anyway, the short answer is write, for me, is write whenever you can. Find short bursts. Thank you. Any others? Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure. And thank you for coming out today. Thank you.